It's the same way for that generation. Just because they're people from history, they're still people, right? Human nature gets tossed out of the equation so much when we do research, and you can't ignore that factor. So for Washington to say no, we're not taking the deal, of course it left the Howes apoplectic. Absolutely. And now you've got these Howe brothers thinking, oh, shit, we were supposed to win. You might have to bleep that out. So, take two.
Prepare for this discussion with the materials our audience used by scanning this QR code or by clicking the link in the description. Then, join us in the comment section. Welcome to Addressing History's Tavern Talks. If you're new here, this isn't your typical history lecture. We're going to break down the barriers between the historian and the public. No podium, no dais, everyone is equal. Here at the Tavern, we flip the script. You, the audience, are the star. Your thoughts, your questions, and your perspectives take center stage in a conversation that is as casual as it is critical. We simply believe that the exploration of history should be a movement of the people, by the people, and most importantly, for the people. And there's no better place to reclaim that tradition than in a tavern like this one, at the historic Mansion House 1757 in Fairfield, Pennsylvania. Tonight, we're traveling back to the dark, freezing winter of 1777 and 1778. The Continental Army has set up camp at a place called Valley Forge, just a few days' march from British-occupied Philadelphia. In the popular imagination, this is a picture of a defeated, freezing rabble, a low point of the revolution. But the reality is far more complex. Valley Forge wasn't just a site of suffering. It was a crucible of transformation. It was here, amidst the scourge of typhus and influenza that claimed nearly 2,000 lives, that a new army was born. Tonight, we aren't just looking at the cold, we are looking at the strategic genius of Washington's choice of ground and the rigorous drilling of Baron von Steuben that turned a militia into a professional fighting force. To help us separate myth from reality, we're joined by our guest historian and Valley Forge expert, Kenneth Gavin. Ken will guide us through the social, political, and economic pressures that made the plateau at Valley Forge the only viable option for Washington. He challenges the standard narrative, showing us that while the army was ill-supplied, it was never broken. So grab a drink and belly up to the bar with us as we get this conversation started on the winter at Valley Forge. So we have, of course, with us the great Ken Gavin, as you all know. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
By the way, the most dapper of all of our guests so far on Tavern Talks. I'm going to call you the Dapper Don from now on.
That'll work.
I like that. You got a tie pin and everything.
Yeah, it's got my initial on it and everything.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Hey, you're fancy.
I know.
Okay, well, so we're talking about Valley Forge today. And just to kind of start us off here, I think I was talking to you backstage in the green room, and you were talking about like what you remember of Valley Forge. What do you know of Valley Forge, right? And I think you had said you talked to your wife and even.
Oh, I don't know if I want to throw her on.
No. But what I'm saying is,
it's already done. He brought her up.
I threw you and your wife under the bus all at the same time. But you, what were you saying? You were saying like you don't really remember or know much about it except that it was cold.
No, I mean I know a decent amount about it, and it was probably about 15 years ago. I went with my sons. They were in the Boy Scouts at the time, And we spent a day, we actually camped there, or camped overnight at a campground, spent a day, on the battlefield, on the site, hiking around. So I remember the huts. I remember them doing an orienteering session with the boys. We went down, I guess it would have been Valley Creek along the trail.
Yeah.
I remember the stone building that was his headquarters, a stone house. I remember kind of the Schuylkill River, and that's about it. I remember the monuments, and I think we were kind of self-guided, so we didn't really have a guide with us at the time. But when I think of Valley Forge, I think of, the cold, the starving. I know that's where von Steuben, really came in and started to kind of get the troops, organized, teach, train them. But that was it. I really, once I started reading this material, I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much more to what Valley Forge is about than what I know I did.
Like what? Give me an example of something that kind of surprised you.
Well, I think, actually, one of the things that caught my attention was that there was a transition of, the quartermaster had resigned. I think it was Mifflin.
August. Yeah, August. It's
Mifflin had resigned, and the Continental Congress decided, well, it wasn't really that important
October.
to have the quartermaster position get filled. So I'm like, well, that's kind of a bit of an issue. The commissary, he was kind of a bumbler, and the clothier was kind of a bumbler, at least from what I'm reading. And it was really Washington then bringing in Nathaniel Greene, which he had to really push the Congress to do to bring him in. And I forget who came in as the clothier, or as the quartermaster. Or quartermaster was Greene, and I forget who came in as commissary. But they kind of really took charge. But it was kind of like they didn't really think of the entire set of colonies. Like they were very focused on getting food and supplies from around Pennsylvania, but not thinking about New England.
Yeah,
and
right.
It was kind of, there's a lot more to it there, and really this was an army that seemed to be in transition coming into Valley Forge and came out of it really a fighting force is what I got the sense
So
of.
if you want to call it a battlefield, it's okay.
Okay.
Now, nothing during the winter, so let me be really clear about that. There's not a military engagement that takes place during the context of the Army's winter encampment. But in the Philadelphia campaign in September of 1777, there actually absolutely is a skirmish that takes place near that Potts House, near Washington's headquarters complex, confluence of Valley Creek and Schuylkill River, because that is an American supply depot. Granted, a small one, but one of the things the British are doing in the fall of 1777 in order to try to eliminate the willingness of patriots to prosecute a war is, let's burn out all their supplies. And so there's an industrial manufacturing center there with 2 iron forges, a sawmill, and a gristmill. The British are in there to cause havoc in September of 77. They blow up the dams on the Valley Creek. So, you're not getting that forceful water hitting things. And then they pull the wheels out of the gristmill. They try to cause as much damage as they can. And before that's Washington's headquarters, that's actually the headquarters for Major John Graves Simcoe, the 40th Foot, for 2 days in the fall of 1777. So there's a little skirmish that takes place. Alexander Hamilton is involved, but it's Americans trying to get those supplies out ahead of the British itself, right? And that supply situation, it's totally abysmal, right? But one of the things that you have to look at is limitations of Washington's power to try to do things to supply his army versus what is the Continental Congress doing. And Congress tends to fracture along regional lines. And they're also an impotent political body for the most part, because Congress lacks power to tax. Congress lacks power to do a lot of things except grant commissions and try to evaluate foreign negotiations and work towards treaties. But it doesn't mean they're doing it right. And we can talk more about supply systems and stuff later, but you're hitting on some key elements that are sort of beyond Washington's control that he's going to try to rein in and exert as much influence as he can. But the solution is green, but it takes them until March to get there. Yeah.
How about anybody else with your memories of Valley Forge or what you knew of it before you got into this? 6 questions, Lentz.
Yeah, like any good forge, it's where you shape and harden metal through difficulty, heat, and not heat, difficulty and hardship, basically.
You're a poet,
Valley
Mike.
Forge could not be more aptly named because the Continental Army, my understanding of it before going into this was it kind of received its identity at Valley Forge.
Yeah.
And that's what it was looking for. It was so much in transition through those first 2 years, but it was Valley Forge that really they found out who they were. I went forward with that.
I've always said, Mike, in a lot of different ways, you could look to when the Continental Congress adopts the Massachusetts Provincial Army in 1775. And you say, well, that's when the United States Army is born. But I've always thought of it as, the Army is a professionalized fighting force. Valley Forge is its birthplace. That's exactly, and for a number of different reasons. I think that's the best way to look at it. Yep.
Anybody else?
I think never been to Valley Forge, going back to just what you learn in school, is you're pretty much told about the revolution. Is they touch on it as it was cold, Washington held the army together, thank God, and then on Steuben came in, we learned how to fight, and we went off and to greater victory. But when you actually going through this process and studying more, it was very eye-opening to me. Just exactly the weather was not what I had envisioned or what I was led to believe as a child.
Yep.
The conditions, the political conditions that Washington was dealing with, all those stresses, and then the supply issues, and then just the clothing, like all of it is very eye-opening to me. And I could not think of a more important thing to study, considering the 250th anniversary of the country, than Valley Forge itself. So those one things I took away from it.
Well, get there. Like anything else when you're dealing with military history, seeing the terrain is key for a lot of reasons. And if we dig into that question about similarities between Meade's position on July 2nd, and if you guys talk about me with that, that was worded specifically for a reason, okay, the way it was. I promise. So you got to see the ground, and those challenges and complexities, unfortunately, are boiled down to this really simplistic couple of sentences for most of us when we learn about this place in school. And the challenge in teaching the revolution is it's a complicated 8-year conflict. And I think, unfortunately, what we do is we try to set guideposts, goalposts. Here's a turning point. It's just like anybody who would want to say, well, Gettysburg is the sole turning point of the American Civil War. We all know that's not true. There's a lot of other things that are really complicated happening in and around that time period that contribute to the summer of 1863 being a hinge point for the war itself. And it's still by no means a done deal after that point in time. But, Valley Forge is one of 8 winter encampments. It's the one that gets all the press, and it gets simplified down. Wayne Bodle writes about the Valley Forge encampment, and he says, unfortunately for most Americans, what it has become is a picture like a Greek chorus, that the Continental Army is this silent, tragic body that marches into this godforsaken corner of the Pennsylvania wilderness, and they're just waiting until spring for the arrival of a comedic Prussian drill master who's going to change their lives. He hits the nail on the head, but are portions of that accurate? Yeah, but only to a really small extent. There's a much richer story that lays beneath all that. Yeah, and one of the challenges I've had guiding there for the past 18 years is, it's a 6-month encampment. I get an hour and a half or 2 hours to tell that story. And if you want to try to contextualize the Philadelphia campaign and a few of the things that happened after it, I'm trying to squeeze 9 months into 2 hours. It's hard enough trying to do 3 days here, right, in a couple of hours with folks for the licensed battlefield guides. They do it very well, but that's a lot of material to try to condense and help people understand. Try to do 9 months in an hour and a half to 2 hours. It becomes a lot more challenging. Yeah. Let's set the stage for this thing and do it in brief, right? We're looking at the middle of a war here. 1777 campaign, the British Army is going to focus on the city of Philadelphia. At least William Howe is going to focus on the city of Philadelphia. Another portion of the British Army is focusing on the Hudson River Valley, trying to cut the colonies/states in two at that point under John Burgoyne. For the main Continental Army under Washington, things had not gone well in 76 at all. If you think about 75, not a bad year for Patriot forces, okay? They've got cannon out of Fort Ticonderoga by early 1776. They forced the British to evacuate the city of Boston. Most of the British Army's hobbling back up to Canada to try to plan what it's going to do again. And then when they get up to Canada and think, what are we going to do to end this thing? They're going to focus on New York City. And if you look at British strategy throughout the course of this conflict, all 8 years of it, think about their main goals. Places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah, St. Augustine, Mobile Bay. All those cities have one thing in common, because they're nowhere near each other on the map, but they're near a feature. What's the feature? Water. They're port cities, right? Now that's going to be critical for transportation for the Army at a very basic level, but at a human need level, Think about what it takes to supply these armies. The British Army, depending upon the campaign, ranges between 8 to 30,000 men. Now, Civil War numbers, World War I numbers, World War II numbers, of course, can dwarf that. But still, if you're thinking about how to supply at a minimum 8,000 human beings for 6 to 8 months at a time, you're going to need several 100,000 tons of supplies, not just for your men, but for your draft animals as well. So you can move your baggage, you can move your artillery. British supplies reliably are going to come from Canada, they're going to come from the Caribbean, they're going to come from the home islands. So port cities are literally umbilical cords for the British forces in North America. If you think about when things go really bad for the British, it's when they stray into the American interior, burn up all their supplies, and they can't reaccess, right? Yorktown's a little bit of an exception, but they're bottled up in there. All right, so, British are going to focus on ports. Continentals, on the other hand, think about Washington and what he does. How much does he win? Not a lot, right? How many major offensive operations does he undertake besides Yorktown? None. None. Absolutely none. He's typically taking an initiative or fighting a defensive campaign. Then what the hell is he doing? Because he's got to have some kind of a strategic goal in mind. He understands that in an era where we don't yet have a national identity, but we're claiming something new called nationhood, that national institutions, those are the Herculean hinges upon which the cause of independence will turn. So it's the Army and it's Congress, which means he has to protect both of those institutions and make sure they don't fade. If one of them fades, the revolution dies. So he's constantly protecting those two things. All right, so that's his strategy in a nutshell if you think about it. Now, New York, the British bring the hammer on the anvil hard and fast. It is the largest amphibious military invasion Britain will undertake until they assault the Dardanelles in the First World War. I want you to think about that for a minute. The scope of this thing. They're going to bring 30,000 troops, several hundred ships to bear on New York. The modern 5 boroughs, if you think about it, it's a series of islands. It's a series of islands in the 18th century, too. Washington's got about 20,000 in his army, not well trained, and his navy is non-existent. How do you defend a series of islands without a navy? It's a foregone conclusion that this isn't going to go real well, right? So when the New York campaign ends, long story short, you've got the British commanders, William Howe, who's got the infantry, his brother Richard, who's got the navy, and they're thinking, all right, we won. It's over. They send peace feelers out to Washington, and I'll paraphrase this, and the peace feelers are pretty generous. They say, look, you're not going to win. I think we just proved it. There's no need to shed further blood. We're all countrymen here. You're never going to be able to stand up to us. So I'll tell you what. Disband your army. Lay down your arms. Send them home. And they can go unmolested. We're not taking prisoners of war. We're not going to take you, Mr. Washington, any of your generals. We're not going after these people who claim to be political leaders. Nobody's going back to London to get tried for treason. We're just going to end this today. That was the sweetheart deal of the 18th century. Because if you think about the way that Britain dealt with Scottish rebels, with Irish rebels, right? Okay? And that stuff is in the back of the mind of our founders. I got to tell you, because just like we're students of history, and we're students of current events in our own world, and we'll look back on the past 15, 20 years of our life, and that forms and instructs the decisions that we make as individuals in a society, it's the same way for that generation. Just because they're people from history, they're still people. Right? Human nature gets tossed out of the equation so much when we do research, and you can't ignore that factor. So for Washington to say no, we're not taking the deal, of course it left the Howes apoplectic. Absolutely. And now you've got these Howe brothers thinking, oh shit, we were supposed to win. You might have to bleep that out. So, take two. So of course you've got the Howe brothers thinking, oh no, we were supposed to win. This is the most expensive thing that Britain has ever done in terms of a military expedition. And now our rear ends are on the line. Not just our military careers, but our political careers. Because both houses, for the vast majority of the American war, sit in Parliament. Just like we have Republicans and Democrats, they've got Whigs and Tories, okay? The Whigs in Britain at the outbreak of rebellion in North America are known to sympathize with the colonists. That doesn't mean they ever wanted the colonists to break off and have their own country and independent, but Whigs looked at recent British history and said, wait a tick, hold on. We just finished this massive global struggle against France and her allies in the 1750s and 1760s, the colonists fought arm in arm with us. The reason we fought the whole damn war was to make North America the keystone of empirical economic might and success for Britain in the entire Western Hemisphere. Just like we're going to count on India in the East. So maybe, just maybe, call me crazy, Parliament and George III, killing our countrymen wholesale might not be the best way to bring them back into the folds of empire, economically, politically, or socially. That's Whig philosophy. The Tories are war hawks. But despite all that philosophy, Howe knows that in order to preserve himself, he needs a big thing, and he's got to end the war. So it's been debated for years. Well, why doesn't William Howe go help Sir John Burgoyne? What if they just concentrated force? What if they had applied that old military maxim, focused all their efforts up there in New York State, tried to defeat Gates and Arnold, and then shifted south to get to Washington? When it's a Ken Gavin opinion that I'm not going to back up with 18 quotes, I'll tell you, this is that moment, okay? But I think if you think about it and factor in the human nature, Howe wants to save his reputation and the war. So when he looks at Burgoyne and says, target of opportunity, what is it? Do I want to split the Hudson and capture that army? Or do I want to capture the American capital? Because if I do that and I can nab Congress, that's checkmate, kids. It's over. So of course he's going to focus on Philadelphia. And that's why the 1777 campaign is being fought in this region. That's my opinion on that one, okay? And it's interesting that Howe is not going to take the overland route from New York to come down here, right? Because that would have been the fastest thing to do. It probably would have been the most reliable thing to do. But he takes the circuitous route by sea from New York City all the way down south and comes up to the head of the Chesapeake Bay at Elkton, Maryland, head of Elk in the 18th century. Why is he doing that? You're burning supplies. You're burning forage for your draft animals. You're going to run out of fresh water over a journey that might take you a couple of months if you hit bad weather, which it does, and it will take a lot of time, and he loses at least half of his draft animals on the way there. He is petrified to march overland through New Jersey because he looks at 1776. We had Trenton, we had Princeton. Everybody hears about that. Nobody talks about the Forage War of early 1777. Yes. Because in order to pacify the state of New Jersey, William Howe just doesn't sit in New York. He keeps a big bulk of his army there, but he says, you know what? In order to keep New Jersey under Crown control, I'm going to spread out 8 encampments, cantonments or cantonments, right? Cantonments, cantonments, same thing. There was a listener who really got into it with me about that one time. So cantonment or cantonment, pick. But those 8 encampments are spread out through the state. And that means they're vulnerable outposts. Trenton is one of those outposts, okay? The rest of them are hit throughout 1777 as well. So when Howe looks at that scenario, he goes, I am not going through that again. He's going to take the sea route, right? So Philadelphia campaign is fought here for that reason. Long story short on that, clearly a disaster for Washington. Brandywine's a big loss on September 11th. September 19th, Congress looks around and goes, we're beating feet, we're out of here. It's too dangerous. They go first to Lancaster. They look over their shoulder and go, putting the Susquehanna between us and the British might be a good thing. They go to York. By September 26th, the British have occupied the capital city. There's your context to get you there.
So, any thoughts from anybody? Steve Byers.
So, you, not to get into the Philadelphia campaign, but obviously Brandywine, huge loss. Mm-hmm. Germantown, we'll call it a valiant defeat. But the thing that stands out, also leading into Valley Forge, is at no point, I mean, Howe had a couple opportunities, especially at Brandywine, where he could have really damaged Washington, but they retreat in relatively good fashion. And Washington deserves credit for getting the army to where they still had like a little fighting spirit there heading into that late fall.
Yeah. You're hitting a really important point, Steve. And even the British High Command is complimenting the Continental forces for the way they form at Brandywine, for the way they retire in good order at Brandywine, particularly the Virginians, and the way that they fight in the vicinity of the meeting house in a rear guard withdrawal action. The British are seeing an enemy with tenacity in an open field. Right. All right. So, and even when you get into October or November, if you look at writings from the generals in the Army or even enlisted personnel, there's the common theme of, if we can get another shot at him, we could probably crack it. We can beat these guys. They have a feeling of that. It all begins to fall apart when all of the cracks in the supply department kind of converge and that thing just shatters all at once. And that happens, unfortunately, just a couple weeks after Germantown. By the time they get to the White Marsh encampment in early November, it's become really clear that he just can't supply that army anymore because there's nobody competent that's overseeing it. But yeah, morale, is not low.
Mifflin, he's the quartermaster,
Mifflin is the quartermaster.
and he resigns what, in October?
in October, and Trumbull had resigned in August.
But he won't be replaced till when?
Mifflin's not replaced until March of 1778.
So there's something about that I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Because we talk about he resigns and then we talk about he's not replaced.
Right.
From my understanding, he resigned, but he wasn't replaced because they didn't accept his resignation. So in Congress's mind, he's still in place, but in his mind, he resigned, so I'm just not going to do the
Yeah.
job anymore.
So
I'd like
yeah.
to understand how that
Yep.
kind of sequence went.
And at the risk of sounding like an apologist for Mifflin and for Trumbull, I kind of want to contextualize why these guys resigned. Because it wasn't like they looked at things and said, you know what, I just don't like this job anymore. It's too stressful. I'm out of here. Sorry about the fact that we're in the middle of a massive campaign. Congress was just really inept from the start. In 1775, John Adams is complaining that he sat through an entire day of that they just formed 6 committees, a committee on committees, and now they're debating another committee, and he doesn't even know what the hell it is.
That sounds familiar.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Not much has changed.
Yeah, no.
Right? So, but as Congress starts to form these departments early in the war, they don't necessarily look around the table to these guys from the different states and say, who might be somebody who knows something about logistics? Who knows something about supply, right? They don't do that. They just make willy-nilly appointments. And in the beginning, that makes it very hard for those departments to be managed. By 1777, Congress looks at itself and says, those systems are really inefficient. We should try to get people into place who know what they're doing. Some of the people who actually know what they're doing are Trumbull and Mifflin. The problem is Congress reserved the right to appoint all of their subordinates. So they were tasked with these major jobs and then told all the people you're going to need to rely on to get your work done, you really don't have a say in who they are because we're going to give these people plum political appointments. And it got to a point for Trumbull in August and Mifflin in October where both of these guys had become so frustrated because bureaucracy kept getting in their way and making them stumble that they said, if you can't change this and make this work, I can't do this job. And with Mifflin, yeah, you're absolutely right. But for Congress to look at that and say, well, I guess we're not accepting the letter of resignation. Well, it doesn't, look, my glass is more full than it is right now just because they say it might be so. It's an incumbent responsibility upon Congress to take care of the Army. And when they don't, that's when you see things like a lot of corruption that's going to filter into an environment post-Philadelphia campaign where supplies that do exist, and they do exist in a lot of different places destined for the Army, are going to find their way into a black market, and they're being sold to civilians and other parties at massively inflated prices. But the Army's being starved almost out of existence by political ineptness and greed at that point in time, and it's cannibalizing itself. Because when Washington's at Valley Forge, he needs everything, clearly. He's writing to General Israel Putnam with the New York forces and has to tell Putnam at one point, stop detaining the wagons that are coming to Valley Forge, because Putnam's looking at all these supplies from New England that Washington wants. First of all, that's a problem that he's got to write to New England for supplies. They're trying to send him down, and Putnam's going, yeah, I'll take that cask of shoes. And Washington has to tell him to knock it off at one point in time. So it's a mess from the beginning until Greene gets in there in March.
The audience. Do any of you have any ancestors who were in the Revolution? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Geez, 5, 6, 7. God, I feel like such a loser. All right. How many of you, those ancestors, were at Valley Forge? One. What was his name?
Sergeant Abraham Loper.
You know?
We talked about him earlier.
We did.
Oh, good.
Yep.
What do you know about him?
I know he was in the 4th New York.
Okay.
I know from the little records I have that he was sick basically the entire time. He shows up sick on like the 22nd of December, again in February, again in April, and he's discharged May of 78, probably due to illness. So
4th
that's
New
about
York.
all I know.
Okay, all right. Well, that's not bad. 4th New York was what? Whose brigade? I'm trying to find it on my list, but I can't find it.
I'd have to think about
Oh,
that
you
one.
got to look at it too.
I do,
Oh, look
yeah.
at that.
Enoch
Look
Ford.
at that.
Ford.
No, yeah, it is Poors. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Poors
my
Brigade.
mind was in Virginia because we talked about.
The other one.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, her other
You're right, Mike.
ancestor
It's
was
right
in
on the paper.
Virginia.
Yeah.
Second damn
Yes.
brigade on the list, and
Right.
I went right past it.
Yep.
Okay, so now, how many other men with Debbie's sergeant ancestor were at Valley Forge with Washington when they arrived?
That depends on who you ask.
Okay, I'm asking
Yeah.
you.
Well, and, it could be 12 to 19,000 are the estimates that range. Seriously. I tend to think it probably falls around 15,000 to get there on December 19th. Not everybody's going to hang out right away. Size of the Army fluctuates a lot over time. The figure the Park Service will use is 12,000. I think 15,000 is a little bit safer and probably a little bit more accurate based on a lot of the research that's been done. I don't want to lose, and I'd love to hear perspectives on this question though before we kind of talk about experience at Valley Forge. Why the Army's there? Like why Washington selects that location, and if people had thoughts on that based on the readings or what they looked at. If they had theories on why he went there and if they would have made the same choice. Because I think the readings had outlined some of the other things that were potentials for him, like Wilmington or a line of encampments that stretched, Reading, Easton, Reading, Lancaster, that sort of thing besides Valley Forge too. So that gets us there. Steve.
So, I mean, the one thing that comes out in a couple of the readings I've done is Washington's choice isn't necessarily his to make. And by that I mean he's got the Continental Congress, which is on the other side of Susquehanna at York.
Yeah.
He's got the Pennsylvania State Assembly, which is in Lancaster, I believe at that point. And they're all wanting him to protect them. And there's kind of even debate, like the Pennsylvania Assembly doesn't want to give up that area outside of Philly, it seems like,
Right.
and to protect the supply bases and everything. So I think when you're looking at all that, Washington's looking for what's the best defensible ground that keeps me close to the British Army, but not so close that we're going to constantly have skirmishing.
Yep.
That I can also be supplied, hopefully, and also, they're not in the middle of the wilderness out there. There's
They're not.
lots of families around. I mean, I think there's 16 to 20 family
It's
or
14 to 16
Yeah,
in,
something like that,
in the
yeah.
area that will encompass the encampment.
King of Prussia Mall is right down the road.
Yeah.
Yes.
Night shopping.
so.
All right. So Mike.
Well, no, I was just jumping off of Steve.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is the political consideration, but
Yep.
also that's a pretty bountiful farming area in that area behind Valley Forge, kind of
Yep.
Lancaster, York
Yes,
area.
yes.
If you're going to protect the breadbasket of what's going to feed your
Yep.
army, you have to protect that and the
Yeah.
approaches to it.
Yep.
Valley Forge just seems like a natural place to place a defensive position.
So I have
Yeah.
a question. We're talking about Valley Forge, but
Yep.
the place I never heard of was Gulph Mills.
Okay.
They were there for a week before
were there
went
for
to
a
Valley
week,
Forge. So
right.
what was it about Gulf Mills, which I assume was like 10 miles?
It's not
or so?
far away.
So
Yeah.
what made it? I think I know why, but
Right.
what was it that
It-
decided let's move to Valley Forge?
It's a good defensive position at Gulph Mills, but that's never where they wanted to be. Okay. He's stuck there for a week. He wants to move to Valley Forge as fast as he can. And I gave you guys a lot of primary quotes about weather in that week leading up to December 19th, just to demonstrate how hamstrung the Army is by the elements every time they want to move. So economics and political targets. Let's think about those two things for a second. Things Washington has to protect. If you're a good military commander and you want to win a war, okay, if I strangle an economy, strangle political will to fight, or eliminate a political body, I can win the war that way. So Pennsylvania and is their concerns, Steve, are a little bit different than you'd see in the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress is looking at this at a macro 30,000 foot level and saying, let's end the war. And that's why you see this foolishness from people like William Ellery, who's saying that the Army should take the field for the entire war. It's like, hello, have you seen what's going on? Right? Or God bless him, Lawrence, who's the president of Congress, Henry Lawrence, is thinking they're going to be New York and Philadelphia by January. It's like these people are delusional, right? So they're macro level. Pennsylvania, though, Pennsylvania is looking at this in a different way altogether. And that Wharton quote, it's a fine point in there where he talks about even good Whigs being discouraged. I know that's in the material I gave you. That's a huge concern. You have Pennsylvania. Thomas McKean is the Supreme Justice of its court in the early 1780s. And he writes about the experience of the Revolution in real time and says, Pennsylvania was not a state at war with a foreign power. Pennsylvania was in a state of civil war within itself. Because leading up to the revolution in the mid-1760s, while we're worried about all these sorts of infringements upon our rights as colonists at that point in time, Pennsylvania's proprietary government is beginning to buckle. After 80 years or so under the leadership of the Penn family as a proprietary government, because between 1715 and 1750, Pennsylvania gets a huge influx of Germanic immigration. 1720 to about 1770, Scots-Irish are coming in. These are people who are totally different than the English who are here who are of the Anglican tradition. They're totally different than the English who are here who are Quakers. They have led a different experience in Europe, one where their rights have been infringed on a regular basis. They get here and they look at what's going on in Pennsylvania and they think their interests are not represented at all. So after a few generations of that, the Germans and the Scots-Irish are looking for opportunities to push up and to get themselves represented. And when rebellion is coming along the way, that is the perfect opportunity to overthrow the Penn family. And that's exactly what's going to happen. And Pennsylvania's state government becomes entirely radicalized in 1776. The Whig thing that they're talking about is a real concern. Whigs being supporters of the rebellion movement. Pennsylvania state government knows that if Whigs get discouraged and then they fall away from supporting the rebellion, well, this new state government that's just come in and has been so radical and has pushed down on everybody who was not a really vocal supporter of the revolution, they're going to get thrown out of power. So they're trying to maintain that balance of power. And it's not a ghost. It's not a phantom that they're seeing over their shoulder. If you look at the example of somebody like William Allen, who is a really wealthy Pennsylvanian. His father had been Supreme Justice of the Supreme Court when Pennsylvania is still a proprietary colony. William Allen in 1775 is fighting for the Patriot cause. He believes that his rights have been infringed as an Englishman and that he needs to defend them. He goes and fights with Wayne at Three Rivers in Canada. But what he says is, you fools declare independence and I'm out. Because that's the stupidest thing you could ever do. And when independence is declared, William Allen's not a Whig anymore. So the Whigs are fracturing along a couple of lines already. So these guys need Washington there as a constabulary force so they can maintain political power in the state of Pennsylvania, which is why they threaten to secede if Washington doesn't stay close. And there's economic targets, yeah. There's enough bread coming out of Chester, Lancaster, and York counties to make wheat to make bread for 250,000 people a year, plus beef, plus dairy, plus all this other stuff, plus Washington supplies, plus the political targets out there too.
Plus, also being close to Philadelphia has some major issues of recent history with this army. Paoli, for example. Being too close to the British can cause you some major difficulties, as Anthony Wayne's troop and his troops found out in September. And so, but also that alternate plan of outposts from Wilmington, that just seems like the New Jersey British plan, but in reverse.
Exactly. That's
exactly
what I was going to touch on, is that if he goes through all these little encampments, like he's already taken advantage of that with the British are doing it. And to where when I studied this and read up on this, it almost seems like Valley Forge almost seems to serve all of the masters that Washington needs to serve. it'll serve his political needs of protecting the government, but also with there only being a limited amount of families here, it has the defensive area there with the Schuylkill right being right there, but it also displaces the amount of land that the army is going to disturb without disturbing as many civilians to upset their equilibrium of the army being there.
Yeah.
Well, it's something that I've thought about, and I've not done enough reading to find if there's any proof to this. And everything that I've seen has been the political, the economic, all of that. But Washington clearly was somebody that always wanted to attack. Like, he wanted to find opportunities to attack and go on the offensive. If he moves his army far away, if he breaks it up, if he does any of that, he gives up his ability to do that. I've not seen any proof to say that was on his mind when he did it, but by going where he was, and I agree, I think he kind of picked the best place that he could have picked with everything that's going on, but it also gave him the ability, put him at risk and Paoli, but it also gave him the ability that if an opportunity presented itself, he could go on the offensive. He wasn't trying to pull his troops from the far-flung reaches.
Well, yeah, he wants to attack, but he's no Judson Kilpatrick. He's not just going to do it.
Right.
Right.
But Eric, do you think it's also a bit of like he wanted to be able to control any almost micromanage, like want to be able to make sure discipline for the army was being intact? Is like having them all centralized in one place for him to have an eye under?
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
That is a good point.
Because I also think Washington knows if he spreads it out, he might not get it all back together.
Yeah.
Well, and at this point in time, and you mentioned it earlier, and it was one of the biggest takeaways for me in reading this, was called the political intrigue that was going on at this time.
Yeah.
How many, she mentioned about, Washington is God. Washington was the furthest thing from God in most people's mind from what I read, because half the generals were out to get him. They all thought they could do better. They all wanted his job. If he started breaking people up and sending them all over the place, what are they going to do when they're out on their own?
Right.
Now they can create their own little world, their own little political society. And at that point, he can't.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest takeaway for Valley Forge for me is
It's
the transition of what he did politically as much as what he did with.
Well, and Washington deals with political opponents. Adam Steuben is a primary example earlier in the war. And Adam Steuben had been a pain in Washington's ass since the 1750s. I mean, and literally doing stupid things on campaign with Washington since the 1750s. When Fort Necessity was surrendered, Adam Steuben was there. And, instead of the Virginia forces under Washington's command getting massacred at that point in time on the way out the door, which was a real possibility at that point, they're able to get out with their lives and some of their baggage. So what does Adam Steuben do on the way out the gate? He literally kicks a French officer in the ass. On their way out the door. We're almost gone, guys. We're almost out of here. We got to go back and get in trouble with Dinwiddie and Williamsburg. And what are you doing? Right? Adam Steuben also causes problems right before Trenton, too, with some attacks that could have blown the whole operation up for them. So, yeah, I think that's a concern with the spreading out of encampments. Spreading out the thin lines, it's what the British did in reverse. Washington thinks that's a terrible idea as well. Valley Forge hits it for all the reasons that you guys have hit on. And I want you to think about it also in a little bit more of a macro level, okay? Valley Forge, where it's situated, and I want to hit this from two different angles. First is the crescent moon theory. Then this one's mine. So if you take it, just say, I heard this guy say it. In order to seal off the British access to the West, Chester, Lancaster, York counties, economic and political targets of value, if Washington were to stay at Valley Forge, well, the British could just march around him unless he's doing things with other portions of his forces. So Valley Forge is the thick center of a crescent moon. Think about it that way. And then he's got Pennsylvania militia on the north side of the Schuylkill River, plus dragoon forces, and that stretches all the way up to Trenton, New Jersey. And then he takes the Marylanders and the Delaware guys under Smallwood, stretches them south towards Wilmington. So that forms a defensive arc that seals Howe off from the American interior. Now, if we want to think about Washington with an offensive mind and wanting to be offensive, yeah, I think he does. But what do? You attack to maneuver or maneuver to attack. Valley Forge is a perfect example of maneuvering to entice Howe to attack. Because just like Washington's being pressured to do things like retake the city of Philadelphia, and I'm going to disagree with Ron Charnow on that point. I don't think Washington ever wants to retake the city of Philadelphia. There's no way he can do it whatsoever. I also don't think that most Americans saw him as godlike. The apotheosis of Washington movement happens in the 19th century. Totally different thing, and that's a different story for a different day. But Howe's under pressure too. Because guess what? When William Howe took New York, what didn't happen? He didn't end the war. When he took Philadelphia, what didn't happen? Didn't end the war. And he's right.
And then Burgoyne surrenders at Saratoga.
Burgoyne surrenders at Saratoga.
That's a black eye.
And now it's like, so Washington, I think part of this, and Howe's not going to do it. He's not going to attack. The reason I think Howe never attacks Valley Forge, let's go back to that human nature thing again. Let's think about William Howe's life. All of us have been burned severely in our lives by a situation or by a person at least once, and it sucks. Sometimes it's happened twice, same person or a similar situation, similar kind of person. By the time it rolls around for the third time and you get a whiff of like something like that, you back off. It's human nature. Let's look at William Howe and direct frontal assaults. William Howe, when he is in direct frontal assaults, we talked about two Howe brothers, William and Richard. There's a third one named George. I haven't talked about him because he's been dead for 20 years by the time we get to this 1778, because he was killed in a frontal assault in Fort Carillon, which we call Fort Ticonderoga during the French-Indian War. This guy watched his brother get killed in a frontal assault. Then he's at Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, whatever you want to call it, in the beginning of the war. And Howe watches this frontal assault, these guys moving up and suffering massive casualty rates. And, I think when he looks at that and his background says, frontal assaults are not for me. So you're constantly going to see him flank and do diversionary maneuvers. And if he can't find a flank or a diversionary maneuver to try to get around Washington, take him in reverse or take him from a flank, he's not going to go for it. Valley Forge, Washington took away his ability to be taken in reverse or be taken in a flank because of the topography of the place.
Yeah, actually, it was funny. One of the questions is about, what's the similarity between the defensive positions? So I took a look at the map and I'm like, wow, it's very similar, right? You have mountains coming down where Valley Creek is. The huts, I think, are on an elevated territory. So you almost have that kind of a fishhook in sort of a defensive position.
And this is where it's good to go out to Valley Forge yourself to see it. Because you could definitely understand how it's a raised piece of ground and easily defensible with that
Especially
river.
as the river, the Schuylkill.
That was going to be my question, was what about the topography of Valley Forge makes that the spot? Obviously you've got the Schuylkill River there that you can back up against and protect. But there's more to it.
It's also an escape route for you if you want to over a couple of different points. Washington controls all the road networks to the west and north. The south and east are what he has to worry about. So if you're out there, and the Duport time map that you guys probably have as part of one of your map sets, it's the one that has the least amount of words on it. You'll see that Valley Forge is generally in the shape of a triangle. There's an outer ridge that runs for about 2 3/4 miles. It's gently sloping ground. If you're attacking, you're coming uphill. But gently sloping, I've got a view of my enemy for a long time. So then when I get to the shortest leg of my triangle, which is 1.5 miles, it runs along Valley Creek, so I've got an obstacle there. Plus I've got Mount Joy and Mount Misery on either side of that creek. So I've got obstacles there. I get to the third leg of the triangle, I've got the Schuylkill River, obstacle to an attacking force, and there's high bluffs along the Schuylkill there too, that during the course of the encampment stretched at heights of maybe close to 100 feet. So Howe's got one avenue of approach that he can come at with this thing. And Washington's got interior lines, he's got defensive depth, he controls the communication networks, he controls roadway access, just like controlling the Baltimore Pike or Tawnytown Road. Washington has that equivalency there. Think about, and I guess we'll just do this Gettysburg thing now, right? Why not? Because it's fun, and we're almost in Gettysburg, we're in Fairfield. But, all right, so think about Washington's position. It's roughly a triangle, kind of turned on its side. Where's this tip of the spear pointing? Tip of the spear points to the enemy. Right, Washington blocks all access to the roads and to the rivers, and because river transport's really important to get out west. The British can't crack towards any of those things. If they want to come at them, they've got to hit tip of the spear. What happens as an attacking force and this is Jominian theory from the 19th century, but we can put it in reverse and it's still applicable because these guys are using this stuff. If you are going to hit the tip of the spear here, what happens when you overcommit to the point if you're the attacking force? You spill over and I open up my wings and I take you in reverse. That's exactly what I'm going to do. And that's what the defense in depth and the secondary lines allow Washington to have the advantage of being able to do that. And if you think about the Union position on July 2nd, after the bulk of the forces get here, let's move beyond the elementaryism of it being a fishhook for a moment. I know we use that phrase because it helps people and it's an easy visual, but for a more in-depth student of the battle, it's not a fishhook because you're ignoring all of those things that are happening behind the lines. And really, it connects and it does form not a triangle, but it forms a salient position. And what's the tip of the spear? The tip of the spear is Cemetery Hill. What happens if there's an overcommitment to Cemetery Hill? What's waiting behind? Yeah, right. The 6 corps right there to take them in reverse.
Actually,
Right?
I've heard the analogy before. It's more like a tent pole or something. It's more what you should think.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can
Besides
apply those
collapse,
those Jominian theories that are there.
Does that go back to the Roman time?
It
For some
does.
reason, I remember
All of this.
some
Yeah, it's
attack
like
where
an
they
ancient-
push in
Yes.
and
It's
gets
it's
saw that
it's all
a couple
ancient,
days ago.
right? So anyway,
So, okay, go ahead.
I
I'm
was
sorry. I
just
thought
going
you-
to say, I think that's an interesting correlation to draw, especially for Gettysburg folks who are more interested in that. Like, take a look at how the story that you know really well applies in another state, another site, or another historical time period, and you can start to draw some interesting conclusions where you'll learn new things about something that you've studied quite a bit by studying something new.
One of the things with Lee attacking is he doesn't know what's on the other side of the ridge. So when you're walking at Valley Forge, you kind of get a picture of all these ridges that are obscuring the number of forces. So we already say we don't know if Washington have 12,000 or 19,000 men. What does Howe know? Does he even
Right.
know what's
Yes.
behind?
Yeah, that's a
Yes.
really good question.
Yeah, what is going on
Yeah.
with the British?
So I say we're not really sure because it's not just well documented about how many of the Army got to Valley Forge, stayed there for an extended period of time right away versus some of these people were there and then filtered out right away. All right. British intelligence operatives are very good. They have an excellent idea of what Washington's defensive positions look like. There are British intelligence maps that are drawn of that encampment, and they have a very good idea of what his numbers are. And the basic intelligence reports to Howe during the course of the winter are, the Army is weak, but the position is strong that Washington holds. If you want to attack them, you have to do a frontal assault. We're going to show you on the map all the dispositions that are here. So Howe has a really, really, really good idea of what's going on there. But he makes the decision that he's not going to assault. He doesn't want to waste lives needlessly and uselessly, in his opinion. And to an extent, you have to look at the conflicted consciousness that somebody like Howe has. And to an extent, it's a civil war. It's a constabulary action. This is not a popular war in Britain at this point in time because they are fighting against their own countrymen. And after France enters the ball game, different story altogether. But somebody like a William Howe really didn't want to be here.
Could it be simplified to the way that Howe conducted warfare in the colonies was he was there to repress a rebellion, and it wasn't until after that it became a revolution?
It doesn't...
To your point of him
Right.
offering, lay down your arms, go home, you're good.
And that was after we declared independence.
Right.
I want to say, if you want to look for a line of demarcation, when does this shift from rebellion to revolution? It shifts from rebellion to revolution when we declare independence. And when all the, or what we consider the original 13, to talk about another simplification point, what we consider our original 13 colonies throw off, if it was a royal government, they throw that off and they elect their own new state governments and they write new state constitutions, which then allow them to say on behalf of the constituency, yes, we want to be part of this thing called the United States of America. That's when it becomes a revolution. Even at that point, Howe and others are really conflicted about how they're going to prosecute this war. And it really is a constabulary action for them. And it leads to the accusations against Howe that he hasn't prosecuted the war enough, that he hasn't been hard enough on the Americans. His subordinate, Henry Clinton, will constantly accuse him of that. And then Henry Clinton gets command in spring of 78, exactly when France joins. And then, the ministry has to say to Clinton, look, France is involved, so we're taking 10,000 of your best troops out of North America. We're sending them to the Caribbean because that's economically really valuable. Go to New York and don't lose it. Right?
Well, the British officers,
Yes.
The generals, when they're in Philly, are they all, I guess, what is the attitude, overall of the British command as far as, will they ever really be able to pacify the rebels, the continent, however they look at it?
I think...
Are they all like thinking that they're going to win, or are there
think
some that are like, oh, this can't happen?
I'm going to broad brush this because there's a lot of guys with differing opinions within British command staff. And look,
Like Pattison?
well, if we think that Washington has political rivals, and he's not the only one, guys. Okay, Henry Clinton is there just like this all the time about whoever will listen when he talks about William Howe. But I do think the British High Command, for the most part, Matt, thought that this war was going to end. I think they were surprised it was taking this long, but I think they thought ultimately the rebellion in North America was going to be suppressed and the empire was going to move on.
So I want to go back to what you're saying, that they saw this as they were fighting against their countrymen. But can you lift up the story of how many languages and how many religions you might encounter as you're walking through Valley Forge?
That's a great
because
question.
it's easy to take Valley Forge and paint what I would say the Revolutionary War portrait that we think of.
Yep.
But it was very pluralistic, if I could use that word.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair point. And I think a lot more than people would think. The vast majority of the army is Anglo, right? Probably about 80 to 85% of it, with some religious denominational differences in there. Anglicans and Scots-Irish are probably the biggest components that you're going to see. But, there are Lutherans, there are other sects, there are Catholics, there are Jews. We have records of Hanukkah at Valley Forge being celebrated on a small scale. Those folks are all there too. If you want to think about diversity in terms of language, is English being spoken? Sure, but so is Gaelic. So is French, so is Portuguese, so is Spanish, so is French. German's being spoken in a lot of places. If you go to the Muhlenberg Brigade, if you transported yourself back in time, and that's usually stop one, it's right near the tip of the triangle, and that's where reconstructed huts are. If you transported yourself back to the encampment, you would have heard German spoken more than anything all around you. Because most of the guys who were in Muhlenberg's brigade were recently here from the Germanic states, or they were the children of people who had immigrated from the Germanic states to come here to the colonies in search of a better life. And that was their culture, that was their language. In terms of race, ethnicity, you're going to see diversity there as well. It's hard to say exactly how many people of color serve in the Continental Army because there's no muster roll spot that asks you to denote that. But you can look at things like names, you can look at things like unit histories, and they'll give you really good clues. Names like Salem, Coffee, Cuff, Jethro, those are almost exclusively assigned to people of color, people of African descent. Washington will have at least 150 Oneidas at the encampment that will join in May. They're there very late for a very specific purpose for scouting. But there are other natives that are interspersed within, from various tribes interspersed in regiments, particularly from Massachusetts. Glover's regiments, seafaring regiments, tend to be some of the most highly integrated in the Continental Army itself. So yes, it is not a room of folks who are just white.
No,
Well, and
sure.
if I
Ken,
could...
real quick before you go
Sure,
on.
please.
Yeah.
Because you passed something, you cheated us out of something here, Ken.
Oh, I'm sorry,
When
Matt.
you give a tour and you go into Muhlenberg's,
Oh, yes, we need this
what
moment.
do you say? What's
Yes.
the first thing you
Oh.
say?
Wir sind in der Winterlager der Muhlenberg-Brigade mit Soldaten am Pennsylvania und Virginia und Maryland. Sie waren hungrig, sie waren krank und sie waren kalt.
I feel like I'm in a
That's
World War
exciting.
II movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Horrifying.
So,
no,
and so I do that with visitors. And so what I said was we're now in the encampment, winter encampment of Muhlenberg's brigade. Soldiers from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland. They were sick, they were cold, they were hungry. But when you start a tour in English, and I've already been doing an intro for 20 minutes, and you look at a group and do that, they're like, Except for the groups from South Central Pennsylvania who are like, yeah, all right. And then I have to tell them I don't have any more German to give you today.
Okay, I won't continue in German. So then tell me the picture of gender diversity, because that's also part of this.
Yes, this is
Excellent question,
great
Lane.
point.
So if whatever number you want to pick, 12,000, 15,000, right, somewhere in that range, and it's one of those things that we're never going to be able to get it down to a T. What I can tell you is approximately 400 women and children are there. And unfortunately, we don't really know a lot of their names. The names of the women that we know with specificity are Martha Washington, who visits George at every winter encampment, because it's an 8-year war, and he goes home, folks, twice during that 8-year conflict. He is home for less than 10 days in 8 years. So she will always visit him, which is a tough thing to do. That's an arduous journey from Mount Vernon. Valley Forge is the closest place she'll go. Early in the war, she's got to go up to Massachusetts. Most of the war, she's going to northern New Jersey or New York State. So she'll visit Kitty Green, Nathaniel Green's wife will visit, folks like that. And while they will do relief work in camp and oversee the higher end social circles, like the celebration of Washington's birthday, Martha helps to oversee that. Who are these other folks? These other folks are everyday citizens like us. And those women and children are called followers, or they are known as being women and children on the strength of the army. And they're called on the strength of the army because they subsist on the army itself. The army will feed these folks, it will shelter these folks. Now, it's an accepted thing to have women and children attached to the military in 18th century European traditions. But there are some rules. It can't just be, Jane Smith from Philadelphia thought, I'm down on my luck. Maybe I can go hang out with the army, do some laundry, make some money. Maybe luck will change. That's not how it goes. You have to be attached to a male who's in military service. That's a hard and fast rule. And when you are there, you're going to have a job, and it's going to be whatever they assign you to do. In many instances, those women and children are doing things like laundry, nursing, seamstress work. They're general laborers in many instances too, because that's where they're needed. In some cases, they will be able to earn a little bit of extra money to do that. Laundry, for example, is one way where women are allowed to charge a set rate to the enlisted personnel and the officers for the washing of clothing. But it's backbreaking work. It's hard work to do something in the 18th century like laundry. It's not as simple. We complain about it today, like, oh my God, 4 loads of laundry. You're not carrying a tub that weighs 30 gallons and then beating the hell out of a shirt with a batten board, rinsing it, twisting it. Like, even things that are simple today that we complain about as chores, it's hard labor. The women and children who are there, who are attached to those men, and by the way, they have to be attached to men because Washington is petrified that women in the army is going to mean prostitution. That's what he's petrified of, and the spread of venereal disease, and that's going to take down the force even further. So he wants them attached to a male, and he feels that's going to lessen the chances of those things happening. The huts at Valley Forge, when they're built, are designed to hold 12 human beings. If you have a wife and a child who is there with Sergeant Smith, they're not getting their own house. They're not building their own cabin for the 3 of them. That structure was meant for 12. You 3 are part of that structure of 12 people. So whatever family life is occurring is happening within the context of that hut. And all these other people are seeing everything that's going on. Dignity, privacy, most of that stuff is going to be out the window. And they're people you know from your hometown. Because the social construct of the military in the 18th century is a lot like the 19th century volunteer army, right? Where you'll enlist with individuals from your hometown. So it's family members, friends, people who know you, who you know. So their struggle is going to be even amplified a bit more than the enlisted men. So we should probably talk about the physicality, the physical struggle. We know food's in short supply, right? They're supposed to be getting rations similar to what you might know as a Civil War ration. Real similar to that, 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, protein element of some kind, mixed with hard bread or soft bread. It's going to be mixed with dried peas, beans, rice, vinegar, cheese, milk, beer, rum, whiskey, etc., etc. What they're getting for the most part at Valley Forge, because the supply networks are shattered, is going to be about a pound of flour per person per day. Sometimes they'll get rice, sometimes vinegar, sometimes a little bit of beef, and a lot of times the flour's rancid. So they're taking that, mixing it with water, and cooking it on rocks or wrapped in leaves, and it's called fire cake. And, it's the world's worst pancake. Try it at home sometime. I've done it. You'll love it. So rations are bad enough just for the men. And on an extended period of time, you're malnourished and you're doing the hard labor of building a city because there's no infrastructure, building all the entrenchments, building the defenses, all that stuff's got to be done. For the women and children who are there helping to make this happen, their rations are cut half. Because 18th century theories on how you subsist a woman and a child, they don't know nutrition like we do today. They wouldn't take into account that you might have expended a ton of energy doing laundry for 8 hours and you're like ready to fall over. They would look at you and say, a woman's generally smaller than a man. You need less food. The child is smaller than the woman. The child needs less food yet. So you have this added component of physical suffering for those women and children. And then you have a male who is attached to that woman and that child. Let me make sure I stay in frame. Attached to that woman and child who is now watching them suffer. And imagine putting yourself in that position. If the people in your family or the person that you love the most in the world is suffering because they're with you. And there is nothing you can do to alleviate that. That has to be really difficult from a mental perspective to be able to handle while you're dealing with everything else. And if you want to talk about the other mental difficulties of that encampment, think about the things that we know. Like, we know they leave on June 19th. We know the supply situation gets better in March. We know the British never attack. Those enlisted guys, they don't know. They live every day not knowing when this hell on earth is going to get better. And in addition to all that, security, defense. This is a good defensive position. We've talked about that. And it can be the best defensive position in the world, but you can't just sit there and wait. You have to have pickets. You have to have sentries. You have to secure the perimeters. So they've got guys a mile to 2 miles out, 24 hours a day, working in shifts. Sometimes 10 yards apart like they should be, sometimes spread out as much as a quarter of a mile from each other. And daytime, you got a clear line of vision. You can see what's in front of you. I can see my buddies on either side of me. I feel okay about that. Night, good luck. Especially bad weather nights. What can you see? What can you not see? And you're talking about guys who have, in the Philadelphia campaign, lived through some pretty horrific combat.
So, Ken, going back to the first question I asked everybody, I always knew it was a cold winter, but it was a very brutal winter, a harsh winter.
Yep.
And the soldiers were starving, they were freezing, they were barefoot, etc.
Yeah.
Let's get into that stuff. First of all, how true is that? Or is that myth? Is that true? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, some of it's true, some of it's myth. I mean, I think it's like anything else. Are they,
what's true? What's myth?
Are they starving to death? No. Are they at starvation level? Just about. They're absolutely malnourished. It's affecting the human body in a lot of different ways, right? When you're not getting what you need. You want to think about that. Let's think about the truisms in the physical conditions of Valley Forge. And let's just think about the winter for a minute, even though they're there till June 19th. But imagine yourself being transported to a landscape. And if you haven't been there, just go there someday and call me and I'll take you around, okay? Been working there for 18 years doing tours. Picture yourself in that landscape. It's not green, it's not bucolic, it's not a preserved commemorative space. It is gray, it is brown, it is depressing. If it's not a light snow or a driving rain, it is that misty rain that none of you, I guarantee you, have a good setting on your windshield wipers to take care of, and it just soaks into you. You're poorly clothed. You're probably missing a coat, a hat, gloves, shirt, shoes. Most of you I'm going to tell you, most of you are barefoot. You don't have stockings. You probably have breeches. You probably have a shirt that is shredded, maybe a waistcoat, maybe a blanket. Hats, coats, that kind of stuff, I don't know. You probably don't have it. So you're outside for extended periods in that. And that's that kind of cold when you're exposed to it for a long time that seeps into the marrow of your bones. And you've all been there. I mean, you know, it's like, oh my God, it's into my core at this point. That's your constant existence there. You layer on top of that the smell of 12 to 15,000 human beings who haven't bathed regularly. You layer in the stench of human waste because your latrines are 300 yards to the rear of your sleeping quarters for good reason, right? Because you don't pee where you sleep. I hope not. Okay. But for these guys, look, on a cold night, cloudy night, snowy night, moonless night, otherwise winter night at Valley Forge. As miserable, as suffering, as naked and starving as you are, worked it in for the first time.
Right, that's good.
As naked and starving as you are you going to walk that 300 yards, potentially fall into that slit trench where thousands of people have relieved themselves all day long?
Ugh.
Delicious.
Or are you just going to, when nobody's looking, go behind the hut and relieve yourself? You're going behind the hut. And that's what they do. It's an undisciplined army. They don't understand the reasons for the rules. So on top of that, body odor, layer in human waste, cold, damp humidity, thousands of campfires, and that sucks everything down on top of you like a pall. That is how you think of daily winter existence in that place when you are trying to build the huts because they don't exist. When you have to constantly work on the defenses because they weren't there when you got there. Those are the truisms of suffering there. Okay, now it gets better in March, yes. But for the bulk of that winter period, that's what you got.
So there's a thing that we're glossing over here that's a very important underlying point of how they were able to get through all this pain and suffering. We typically, when we think of morale in armies, we think well-fed, well-supplied, and we won. That's good morale. To get from when they got at Valley Forge to get all the way through on a day-to-day basis, what were they doing to help keep up morale? And it sounds simple, but there are little things that make a huge difference over time.
And on top of that, what were the desertion rates?
Okay, let's try to sculpt this here first.
Right.
Okay, so your question.
Right.
Yeah, it can't just
What
be
are they doing
6
for
months of
morale?
suffering. There's something you got to be doing for your troops' morale.
So,
It's
like,
not just
right.
supplies and winning battles.
So the conditions that they're in,
Yes.
right?
Right.
Okay, winter. Before you get into his question, though,
Yes.
right? I just want to really, what are the conditions they're in? Because we talked about this when you came on the podcast.
Yeah.
I grew up in North Jersey. Don't hold it against me. And there is a place there at Morristown called Jockey Hollow.
Yeah.
And I remember going there, and the Rangers there were like, "Well, Valley Forge gets all the attention and all the credit, but we had a worse winter."
They did.
And they did. And I said, well, then why don't we hear about you? What's the difference? And he said the difference was they learned their lesson at Valley Forge and they didn't repeat it here. But weather-wise, they had a worse winter.
They did.
At Morristown. Is it true that within the 6-month period that they were there at Valley Forge, it only rained or snowed like 10 times?
Yeah, and only about 2.5 to 3 feet.
2.5 to 3 feet.
Total,
But now, do you know what it was at Morristown?
At Morristown, it's several. It's several feet.
72 feet.
Right. Yeah.
No, I don't know what it was.
Well, I mean, it was a lot. It was a lot. You were convincing.
It was one on top of another.
Yeah.
Is
well,
what they were telling.
Look, the Morristown winter, we've got weather records. We're not making any of this stuff up. I mean, in Philadelphia, there was a guy whose name was Pemberton. His records are at the American Philosophical Society. He was recording temperatures, barometric pressures twice a day at his home in Bucks County, plus any precipitation. He was measuring it. And we know that Morristown winter is the worst one on record in the 18th century. And Morristown, the army is locked into place and it can't move and supplies can't get in because of the severity of cold and snow. But Valley Forge, it's not a cakewalk, but it's not as bad in terms of weather conditions that are there.
But it's still bad.
It's still bad.
Shoeless in snow, right?
And for anybody who says, well, it wasn't that bad, I invite you to go to Valley Forge and spend a week outside in December.
In the snow.
You know?
So now that's the scene, right?
Yes.
Weather-wise and everything.
Yeah.
So to Coleman's point, how do you keep morale up?
So to
with all
Coleman's
that?
point, there's a couple of different things. The fact that the commander-in-chief is a visible presence to that army. It goes a long way. Because look, Washington could have really done whatever the hell he wanted. He could have gone back to Mount Vernon and stayed there for the winter and left things in the hands of subordinates. Now, the army would have dissipated if he'd done that. But the fact that he is making daily rounds throughout the encampment, listening to the complaints of soldiers, even if he's not able to immediately relieve them, that presence goes a long way. I think, too, the fact that they've got something to do. The work is going to keep morale up as well. If they were just plopped down, constructed the huts and left in there, I think that would have been a bad move. But the fact that they've constantly got them doing those sorts of things, working on the defenses, working on other things in the encampment, and always the chance, Coleman, of your unit or your little squad going on foraging detail. Because they're rotating them throughout the army too. That's happening quite a bit where guys might go away for a week, to 3 weeks at some point in time to local communities to try to help get supplies for the Army. Foraging, and then they're getting billeted in homes, billeted in barns, billeted in conditions that are a heck of a lot better than where they're going to be at. So I think a combination of those things, plus the fact that they're not going to let each other down, right? The social construct of that army goes a long way because they come in with those social ties. They're not just forging them in military service already, knowing everything that they've been through. I think you have to look at all of that holistically and say those things help to bolster the morale. And we're looking at a period, where it's bad until March. So maybe 3.5 months. If you back it into White Marsh, 4.5 months, where that morale could be a real issue. So that's what I think about that. Desertions. Very good, Michael. I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. There are desertions in the Continental Army during the course of this winter. Perhaps about 800 to 900 total. Some of these guys are going to come back. Some of them aren't. When the guys who do come back, some of them are pardoned. Some of them are not. And they're going down. If you look at, though, the desertion rates in the Continental Army in the winter of 77 into 78, and you want to compare that on a percentage basis just to federal forces in 1861, you're going to see it's minuscule. The comparison was like really, really small. And when we look at the American Civil War and the Raj Militaire in 1861, we don't really think about desertion. We don't think about desertion on either side really until you get to late 63 and onward in that conflict. So the problem, I think, is a lot smaller than most people would imagine. And I do think the social construct has a lot to do with that. There are also no mutinies at Valley Forge, right? Where we're going to see mutinies at Morristown. And the mutinies at Morristown are really interesting because they're not necessarily about supplies. The mutinies at Morristown are about the terms of enlistment and are those enlistment contracts being respected?
Just like the 20th Maine and the 2nd Maine.
Well, the confusion is with a lot of those guys at Morristown, they've signed enlistment papers that say they will serve for 3 years worth of war. And their 3 years are up. And they go, 3 years are up. And then, the officers turn around and go, second clause, or the war. Well, it's not both, it's one. Pick one or the other. It's like, no, you're here for the war. And that's a problem, right? That's a problem in a lot of ways, but it also taps into something. Part of the reading that I asked you guys to do was, how is Pennsylvania totally unprepared to be the seat of war? Colonists squabbling over enlistment contracts is nothing new. If you look at Massachusetts provincial forces in the 1750s, they almost all go home when they feel that British High Command is not going to respect the rights of their enlistment contracts. So this is not a new kind of development. Morristown is unfortunate. They look at that's where that's going to happen. But the mutinies, again, there aren't conditions. It's I've done my duty. I'm ready to go home. Valley Forge too. It's a new army. And when I was talking about demographics, part of the thing, Elaine, I wanted to hit on was exactly what you asked me about. The other thing I wanted to look at with demographics of that Continental Army, though, was how long have these guys been around? And the answer is not very long. Because in 75 and 76, Congress will only authorize 1-year enlistments for troops. Because Congress is afraid that a standing army is going to be a problem. They look to the example of ancient Rome and say, standing armies tend to overthrow the political leaders, so probably not a good idea. Also, we really shouldn't expect guys to give more than a year. They've got families, they've got business concerns, they've got farms, etc. But that creates a problem for Washington because after a year is up, well, now these guys are going home when they might just be useful. So in late 76, Congress begins authorizing longer term enlistments. And that takes effect in early 77. And I think there was some chatter earlier from somewhere about, new enlistments. The new enlistments are happening in late 76, early 77, because those guys are gone, those armies from the first 2 years. Trenton and Princeton, when you look at that, everybody was like, wow, the 10 crucial days is amazing, those victories that Washington has. And they are absolutely amazing, but it does nothing to keep the army together. On the eve of Trenton, Washington has 11,000 effective soldiers. 2,400 who are fit to duty make that crossing on Christmas night to hit Trenton on the 26th. By the end of the Battle of Princeton, 10 days later, he has 1,400 effectives. By the time he gets to Morristown, his army has shrunk to about 975. By February of 1777, there are just over 600 rank and file in the rolls. 600 in the entire main Continental Army, which means that February of 77, they have to start recruiting immediately. So the fact that they recruit up to 20,000 to fight in the Philadelphia campaign is phenomenal. But it also means that these guys are new to service and have only had a modicum of training in the spring. So for them to do all the things that they had done and get as close as they had in that 77 campaign, that's pretty astounding stuff. But they're learning hard lessons because they're new and they're doing stuff for the first time.
So we're talking about numbers and the high losses during the winter. Did they ever take a breakdown of how many like women and children died, or is it?
Yes.
I'm
Good
just
question.
curious.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I've never seen a statistical breakdown on the number of those deaths that might involve women and children. Now, if we want to think about overall loss rate during the winter.
And while you're doing that,
Yes.
throw in hospitals and doctors and all that stuff.
Okay.
I would just think that children would probably there'd be a high loss because of all the disease. And
I haven't seen
winter.
any accounts of it, which is interesting, and I've tried to read what's out there. That book I recommended by Nancy Loane, Following the Drum, is really the best account that's ever been done about women and children at the encampment. But for the most part, the disease is going to be a problem in the spring. More than it will be in the winter. Guys are getting sick. Some guys are dying in the colder months. But ironically, when supply situations get better, when weather gets warmer, when von Steuben is there, that's when a lot more guys start getting sick. It all goes back to the sanitation and how bad that was, and it creates just a breeding ground. They don't know germs, right? Because Lister isn't born yet, but it creates a breeding ground for that. So you have typhus, typhoid, but dysentery is the chief killer. And you know,
influenza too.
Influenza, cases of that.
Well, I just wanted to comment. I'm an infectious disease specialist, and the first time I went into Valley Forge, we had bars. You saw those huts. I said, I'm surprised anybody made it out of here at all from a medical standpoint. Because if you want to set up the perfect conditions for transmitting these diseases,
you got it
right there.
Yeah.
Dr. John, do you know, I have
Shipping
here
was a factor
the
there.
treatment
Yes, it was.
treatment for dysentery. Do you know what it was back then?
Treatment?
The treatment for dysentery.
Yeah, they purged.
Yeah.
No, at that time, but do you know
They're
what they
still
gave them?
purging
Yeah,
it
it's a
around.
purgative. Yeah.
Which was what? Castor oil, hot lard with eggs inserted between the buttocks.
Well, I think they had mercury too.
Right. So
Mercury for dysentery?
So
Yeah,
Same-
believe
the same
it or
location?
not, the treatment of diarrhea was to give you more.
she
Was
reads
to give you more diarrhea?
Because
So-
they purge the toxins from your system.
Yeah, so what they're doing for the most part, that whole hot irons up the buttocks is not I'm not familiar
No, it
with
isn't a hot iron. It's an egg.
Right. Well,
Hot lard with eggs.
Okay. Well, still
not pleasant.
Still not pleasant. So, if Dan, can we start over? Dan,
can you cut it, please?
Can you cut that comment I made,
Give me a
please?
second.
I will eventually get to Jody's question, but yeah, okay. So the treatments, if you will, for dysentery. And look, if you've had salmonella poisoning in your life, you've had something akin to amoebic dysentery, right? It's not pleasant in any way, shape, or form. It is vomiting and diarrhea mixed with copious amounts of blood. In the 18th century, one of the alternate names for the dysentery is the bloody flux, all right? Because that's what you're seeing come out with everything, right? Yeah. So your treatments are going to be a lot of low-dose administrations of Ipecac and tartar emetic, which are abdominal expectorants. It's low doses of purgative poisons that are going to make you vomit and go to the bathroom more. Ugh. Right? That's what they're giving them. And really, look, folks, that's where medical science is at the time. They think that if you are sick, you have a humor or a bile within your system that is misaligned. How do we realign those humors and biles? We got to get rid of stuff to make that happen. We'll monitor you until we think that you're well. They don't have germ theory yet. They don't know about antiseptics. They don't know about antibiotics at that point in time.
Who's administering these medications at this time?
So these are regimental surgeons or surgeons' mates. And here's how the hospital system, Jody, will work, and this ties into the deaths. So with sickness on the rise, The hospitals within the bounds of the encampment see a spike in patients in the springtime. Washington orders every brigade that he's got there to have what he calls a flying or temporary hospital. It's constructed 100 yards behind the center of a brigade's given line to just make it central and easy for folks to get to. So if you were to wake up in the morning and you were ill, that was reported, if a first sergeant were to believe you, he'd send you to the hospital. You're evaluated by a surgeon or a surgeon's mate. They'll listen to your complaint. They're going to prescribe a course of treatment. Sometimes that might be taken back to the hut. Other times they may look at the condition of the individual, and could be an injury too. It might not just be sickness. It could be a busted leg. It could be a busted wrist that they have to treat. They might admit you to the hospital. If you are admitted to the hospital, it is never foreseen that you will stay there for more than 7 to 10 days. If you are still complaining of a malady and you're not showing signs of improvement, you will be transported out. And you will go to a more permanent general hospital at places like Ephrata Cloister, at Lidditz, Chester, Yellow Springs, Reading. That's where those more permanent hospitals are. As a result of Washington using the hospitals that way, the vast majority of the men who die of disease die at the hospitals, not in the encampment itself, right? So we know of about 10 or so graves, and that's it, within the bounds of the encampment itself.
And by the way, what happened in the Civil War, basically the same thing, was still, the system was the same.
Yeah.
The Letterman system.
The Letterman system is
the
a
same
perfection.
system in the Civil War.
They're doing that triage Letterman system here, just a little bit differently. They perfected it, Dr. John, in fixed encampments, where they haven't really perfected that triage system that Letterman will take a hard look at in the 19th century, is on the battlefield. Battlefield triage is a mess in the 18th century. But roughly 2,000. Now, the army that ends up leaving Valley Forge because of recruitment during the course of the winter, and because Washington, as weather gets warmer, starts calling in some of those forces from the Crescent, especially when it becomes clear that the British are moving towards New York City, the encampment swells to about 20,000 by June, which makes it the third or fourth largest city in North America at that point in time, which is pretty wild. They cut a city out of nothing like that. There are also inoculations that are going on there for smallpox. If you want to think about the medical department, that's also happening. A lot of troops who are new to the Army, one of the first things they're being asked is...
1778, new recruits had to be vaccinated.
Inoculated if they had not been already. And that's an interesting process, too, in the way that they do that. There's a small incision under the skin, and then if you've ever seen the John Adams series, that's really accurate, the way they do that. And then they put these guys in quarantine for 3 to 4 weeks. And when they break out in scabs, they do really interesting and fun stuff, like rub sulfur on it and all that kind of thing, too. Yeah, so, yep, to prevent scabies. But hopefully that addresses most of what you were asking.
All right, so yes, Debbie.
You said we know about 10 graves or so that are those within the park?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Where are those located?
So there's one that's really easy to find. It's the misnomer is the Waterman Monument. It's right across from Washington Memorial Chapel. Lieutenant John Waterman was a quartermaster from Connecticut. For some reason that we still really don't have a good answer to, his grave was marked. And he had a military funeral in 1778, even though Washington said, we're not really doing military funerals anymore for these ranks, but his was there. The grave was there. The stone was moved in the 19th century because when people started to come there to tour, people were chipping away at it to take pieces as a souvenir. So the original stone is in the park's collection, and there is a monument that was placed by the Daughters of the Revolution in the early 20th century that is there now. The other graves that are marked, if you've been there before, and you're taking the driving loop and you're at the Wayne's Woods picnic area, park there, and then walk down the hill about a quarter mile of a little more. There's a little grove inside the trees with several stones that are marked there. And when I tell you, like, that's all we know, it's all we know. The grounds of the park were tested in the late 70s and early 80s by NPS, and they did a lot of ground penetrating radar to find out what was underneath our feet. And what they were finding was offal pits, trash pits, but not mass graves. Yep.
What was the first pits you said?
Offal.
Oh, awful. Okay.
O-F-F-A-L. Yes.
Okay. So, von Steuben.
Von Steuben. Yeah. What do you want to know?
Well, what does everybody think about him? Any thoughts on him? We'll start with the audience here, because it is about the audience actually today.
Well,
And
when
we'll see
you
what they think.
learn about him, like, you know, you learn that he's the one that whipped the army into shape.
Yeah.
And going through this, what I thought was very interesting was his backstory of how he came over here and how elaborate and how embellished his introductory letter was from that Franklin gave to the Congress, correct?
Yeah.
And it almost seemed like he was a disgraced officer from Prussia and then just kind of was looking for new glory. And
Wasn't there like confusion about, like, wasn't he actually a lieutenant, but the Franklin said he was a lieutenant general or something?
Yeah, there was that kind of fudging of his story.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's just disgraced. It was just after the 7 Years' War, there
Yeah.
was not a tremendous amount of demand
Yeah.
for military officers. So someone like Friedrich von Steuben is now out there without a job, and he's trying to find something to do.
And to be clear, I mean, not to get away from von Steuben, but that happened a lot. There were a lot of European officers who were like, what do I do now? And like, as soon as the revolution started, like, I got to get there.
Yeah.
Like, I can go do something.
Yeah, there's a reason why if you
But-
look at somebody
Polish guys.
like Charles Lee, who's a British officer in, you know, the 7 Years' War, he fights in the Polish army, right? And he eventually fights for the Continentals. So guys moving around in European armies is nothing new. Jomini, who we talked about earlier, who's born in 1779, Jomini serves on Ney's staff in 1805. Jomini holds dual commissions with the Russians and the French at the same time while France and Russia are at war with each other. Figure that one out and get back to me, right? But so it's nothing new, but it's exactly what you hit on, is that after the 7 Years' War, because that becomes global, right? It's not just France and England. Everybody's got skin in the game, and that's all over the place. After that war ends, all these European militaries start downsizing what they deem are unnecessary positions at that point. And look, basically von Steuben gets riffed. That's what happens to him. And as like taking pity on a guy who had been wounded at Treptow on the Russian front, had served on the staff of Frederick the Great. It wasn't like he was a desk jockey all the time. He was given jobs in Germanic courts as an administrator. They were desk jobs. Somebody like von Steuben, that wasn't his thing. It's not what he wanted. So he wanted to come to America. Part of the problem, and he's seeing European officers do this. Part of the problem with von Steuben is when he gets himself over to Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin in Paris, he's expecting that the Americans will greet me, they will pay me, they will give me a rank, because that's what all my friends have gotten. And von Steuben is told, hey man, your credentials are great, but look, here's the deal. The American officer corps is starting to get a little agitated that we keep bringing in all these Europeans, promote them ahead of them, and put them in command slots, especially guys who can't communicate well with our troops because they don't even understand the language we speak here. So von Steuben is told, you can volunteer, we'll pay for your voyage. And initially he says, forget it. And for whatever reason, he rethinks that. And that's when this letter is written. And yeah, he's a lieutenant in the Quartermaster General's Department at one point. Franklin writes this and portrays him as a lieutenant general serving under Frederick the Great. So two wildly different ranks, of course, right? Everybody be there. But it's not a question of disgrace. You know, I think that comes in with the questions about von Steuben and sexuality, right? You know, people ask me this all the time on tours, and like, was von Steuben gay? And I'm like, you know what? The answer is, I don't know. Because we don't have anything that tells us whether or not he was. And most of the people who ask that question, like really blatantly, want to do it because they want to find a hero or they want to vilify him and they want to put it on that. Right? But, you know, were people gay in the American Revolution? Yes. Of course. I mean, let's go back to human nature, right? Yes, they were.
Who was gay?
I don't know that.
Well, then it didn't happen.
All I'm here, right? All I'm saying is there have been a lot of people who tried to discredit him based on what they thought were rumors about his sexual relations with people, which is a really unfortunate and terrible thing in a lot of ways. Yeah. So that's where that sort of weaves its way in to the criticism of von Steuben. Now, what happens when he gets here? And this guy, by the way, is like 47 or 48, right? He's not old. I just turned 46, so 48 is not old. Okay. If you think about the Continental Army and its general officers at Valley Forge, Lachlan McIntosh from North Carolina is the oldest. He's 62. Lafayette is the youngest at 20. The average age is 40.95. These are young guys. Washington is 46. 46 when he's dealing with all this. This is crazy to think about. So von Steuben's not that much older. When von Steuben arrives, it's not until late February, early March, presents himself to Congress at York, and Congress sees his credentials and says, go to Washington, who is without an inspector general because Thomas Conway will not be fulfilling that post after Horatio Gate, right? And Conway cabal. So when he gets here, what does he do? What a good leader does, evaluates the situation. That's what von Steuben's going to do. Washington says to him, I know you're serving as a volunteer. If you can help me reform the Army, I will use everything at my disposal to get you real rank here in America. And von Steuben is made acting inspector general, evaluates the camp, horrified by the lack of discipline, by the filth, by just everything he sees. And he writes to a French officer he knows who's serving in America and says, you and I have always had the luxury of commanding Europeans. They obey us without question. But these Americans, first, they must understand why something ought to be done, and only then will they do with it. Now, right?
True.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
So being a pain in the ass.
True.
250 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Happy birthday, America.
That's right. Question everything. So von Steuben looked at what he could have done was said, you know what? These guys are a mess. This place is a mess. I'm out of here. And he is a Prussian nobleman. He's Junker class, which means he's not way up there, but he's nobility. He could have gone home if he wanted to. But instead of doing that, he works with the situation. He develops a plan. He pulls guys from Washington's Life Guard, and he pulls men from a lot of different regiments within the encampment itself, and he forms a model company of drill. And he's going to get his hands dirty and drill them himself. And that's a new thing for the American Army, to see somebody like that, a high-level officer, drilling private soldiers. And von Steuben's basic method is, look, guys, you've been working with a number of different drill manuals. Please forget all of that now. He probably said, forget all his goddamn manuals and do whatever the hell I tell you, because he could curse a blue streak, right? He did. We're doing it my way. New way today. And undoubtedly, he's influenced by the Prussian manuals that he knows, by French manuals to which he's been exposed. And what he does is try to simplify things as much as he can. So he starts with, what is the position of attention? How do you face to the right, to the left, about? After these men master those things, now let's work on a manual of arms. Now that you know the manual of arms, how do you load and fire the musket? How do you use the bayonet? How do you march in time at various cadences as one person? 5, 10, 15, 25, 50, 100 of you. Moving as one machine in lockstep. Real European military efficiency and proficiency, and in a Prussian sense. And when he gets these guys where they need to be with those basics and those maneuvers, he sends them out to their home units. And he's like, you train others now.
Yeah.
Under the supervision of the sub-inspectors I've appointed to make sure you do it right. What he's done is he's created the first corps of drill instructors in the United States Army.
Yeah.
The first trainer.
Yeah, it's turnkey stuff.
Forky says like he trained a bunch of majors and then sent them back to train.
He trained sub-inspectors.
Yeah.
Right? The sub-inspectors watch everything that he's doing with the models, and then the models go out and the sub-inspectors go with them. So by the time you get to May the 6th, and we celebrate the French Alliance on the Grand Parade, that's von Steuben's chance to show what these guys are now capable of. And they are now moving as a professional force, as one, under a common code of drill for the first time in the existence of the Continental Army. That is a remarkable achievement. He's probably done this in somewhere between 8 to 10 weeks. It's not everything that he's going to eventually teach them, but it's the really important stuff that gets them humming. All right? Now, more impressive than the timing is when you know he's learning English as a second language while he's doing this, because he's fluent in German, French, Italian, speaks a little Russian. Curses in all those languages very fluently. And there are accounts of him going to his translators who he works with on the field after he's done screaming at guys in German and French, curse at them in English because they're not doing what I want them to do. And then this guy goes back to his quarters at night and writes out everything that he's done during the day, and he writes it in French. And then he hands it off to American officers like an Alexander Hamilton or a John Lawrence who are fluent in French, and they translate it to English. They're writing the Blue Book on the fly day by day. Day by day. And it's not, that book doesn't get printed till 1779, which means handwritten copies are being circulated through the American Officer Corps, and they're slowly, over time, adapting von Steuben's new method. Now, the drill is one important aspect, but I want you to think back to a high-ranking officer getting his hands dirty drilling. The Americans had used British models in the past, where officers usually were a bit distant, and the sergeants did the direct drilling with those privates. What von Steuben is doing, interestingly, as a Prussian nobleman, is sending a message to the American Officer Corps about what it means to be an officer, how you take care of your men. If you ever take the trouble to read the Blue Book, you'll see half of it is military tactics, maneuvers, manual of arms, drill. The other half of it is, depending on what your rank is, this is the rest of your job. This is how you take care of the people under you. So the American Army's rebirth there, and its birth as a professional army, has a couple of really important layers to it. He is made a major general. He will become inspector general. He's with Washington until the end of the war. He's one of the last ones with Washington in 1783. Von Steuben expends his entire personal fortune serving the American war effort, and he dies impoverished in New York State in the 1790s.
Was the only word that he learned in English goddamn? Is that true?
He eventually learned more than that.
He did, okay.
But it's really easy because in German, it's almost the same.
It's the same thing.
Gottverdammt.
Precisely.
So now that he's got the army functioning like a professional army, what do the British think the first time they see this? Because they're used to them being not so well put together. So when did they first see this new version of the army, and what do they think? Or do they
Monmouth.
tell us?
It's within 9 days after the Continental Army leaves Valley Forge. I mean, the bulk of the army will leave on June 19th. Monmouth is fought on June 28th. It's only 9 days later. Right, and that will be the first time they're exposed to this new American army. They saw glimmers of this in the 77 campaign when British High Command complimented begrudgingly some of the ways that the Continentals would form or their tenacity. Monmouth was a whole new ballgame at that point, and you have to imagine British High Command's head is already spinning at that point. Hal, who'd asked to go home and be relieved of command, has gone home. He went home before the Valley Forge encampment ended, right? The British Army is still in Philadelphia. Henry Clinton has taken over. France has entered the war. And that's when Henry Clinton is told, suspend any thought you had of offensive operations, effective immediately. Evacuate Philadelphia. New York is more important to us right now strategically. Take your army there. Don't lose it. We're sending 10,000 of your guys to the West Indies. Which had to leave Henry Clinton crestfallen. Because he has been living in Hal's shadow, thinking Hal's been making mistakes, thinking Hal isn't aggressive enough, and just at the point in time where Henry Clinton was given the keys to the car, he was told to put that in the garage and take the golf cart, right? You can't underestimate, though, France's involvement in what that means and why this made the British freak out so much. Because now it's not a constabulary action anymore. Now we're going to be at war with a traditional enemy, one that we fought at least 6 times in the 100 years previous to the American Revolution, one that has a powerful infantry fighting force. The French army is bigger than the British one. The British actually have one of the smaller standing armies in Europe in the 18th century because they rely on sea power. And as an island nation, they rely on naval strength and naval superiority to protect them more than infantry. But if you're a continental European country, you're going to have to maintain a strong army, and it's an army in arms race against your neighbor who may not be your friend. So France has a large army. France has a navy that can go toe-to-toe with the British on the open seas. France has the ability to do things like invade the home islands. Channel Short, we use it in 1944 to go over and liberate Europe, okay? So it could have been done in reverse. They have the ability to threaten British interests in the slave trade off the western coast of Africa. They have the ability to go after burgeoning British interests in India. They have the ability to attack the Sugar Islands in the West Indies, which we call the Caribbean today, square inch for square inch, some of the most valuable real estate in the world. And before the war ends, France will do every one of those things with the exception of invade England itself. And in 1779, it was this close to happening. Because by that point, Bourbon, France is allied with Bourbon, Spain. And a joint Franco-Spanish fleet planned to invade England. And boy, that would have been a sweet thing for both of those empires. And a storm blows that off course. But what it does is it forces the British now to think globally. And after 1778, the British lion's paws are getting stretched all over the globe to try to protect their interests. And their allies are very few and far between. So it creates a nonstop grind to the war as well. When you see things shift to the Caribbean, that usually happens in the winter months when it's not good campaigning weather in North America. Well, hurricane season has ended in the Caribbean. It's perfect campaigning weather there. And the British are just worn down by 1783. So this French involvement thing is a very, very big deal. Don't operate under the illusion that France does this just to help us. Right?
There's something
Yeah,
in it for
I mean, and it's a big gamble, right? Because you go back, the French-Indian War ended in 1763. So France's skin in this game is to reclaim North America. Because France's total expectation is that our experiment in Republican democracy fails, and when it fails, they'll pick up the pieces and take North America. If you look at the treaties we signed with the French in 78, in February of that year, amity and commerce is one, alliance is the other one. Amity and commerce, one of the key elements is France says with victory, we're going to take fishing rights in the area of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, we're going to take all that. And in alliance, I believe they talk about the West Indies, and France says, hey, look, any of those isles that pertain to the crown of Great Britain, yeah, we're going to take those. I want you to think about that for a second, right? Go back to the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, if you want to call it. Some of the most fought over outlying ports. Fortress Louisbourg, up in the far north off the Canadian coast, and then there's a lot of fighting over Cuba and other places in the West Indies. Why? Two factors. Economics of fishing, economics of sugar, rum, and the slave trade, but also if you need to defend a mainland or you want to springboard to invade a mainland, you need strong offshore ports. And that's what the French are claiming so that they can dominate the eastern seaboard after the United States of America falls apart, which it doesn't. And France spent $18 billion on the North American Revolution when their treasury was already racked by the 7 Years' War. So us not falling apart, their economy falling apart, a French Revolution happening, and us in 1798 saying, stop screwing with our seamen, we're gonna annul those treaties. Stop this stuff in the open seas. We say the treaties don't even matter anymore. And then, as you see, the French monarchy falls apart. So big deal, Mike.
Yeah, and so after Monmouth, right, which is the next major battle in 78, the campaign in the north dies out, essentially. Because the British retreat back to New York City.
Yep.
They don't really go on any offensive operations that are large scale like they had previously. Yep. And so Washington is still hyper-focused on New York City throughout that entire time.
Yep.
So as far as the direct impact of what von Steuben does in providing professionalism to that army, providing drill, he doesn't have a lot of experience or a lot of opportunity to exhibit that outside of Monmouth.
No.
But what it does is it gives the American army, the Continental Army, an identity, a professional identity, which they're going to really rely on going forward in the war and sometimes in the campaigns for the South.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to put it, and I think that's part of the reason why Monmouth, even though it's so hot that day, and more guys are going to be heat stroked than anything else, Washington is talking to his subordinates about wanting to continue to push because he wants to see what this new army can do, and he's finally got the Brits on their heels because he caught up with Clinton's rear. Monmouth develops by Washington's choice because he knows the British are moving north from Philadelphia to New York City, and they're going to have to move through Monmouth Courthouse. Washington wants to let most of the British army pass through, wait for the rear guard and the baggage, and strike that logistics network, overwhelm the rear guard, and if a general action envelops, to go toe-to-toe with the British in an open field. But he wants to start by destroying their supplies and causing havoc in their rear lines. All right, and he really wants to see what these guys are able to do. The heat of that day, though, will sort of dictate when that action is going to end. Yes, Loane.
So as you start to put the story together, and I'm going to take your reference that you said at the beginning about the forge, because you just said new army. So really, because I think a lot of us came in, they suffered, it was hard, it was cold, hunger, etc. But the story seems to evolve into it was a place to forge a new army that could actually impact the outcome of the revolution.
And the suffering's part of it, but yeah, I mean that, and what Washington wants outside of the defenses, all those other things we talked about. One of his desires for that winter is to do just that to this army. He talks about that as well. The problem is, until von Steuben arrives, that he can't do it because he can't do everything himself. It's the Inspector General's job, and the guy Congress tried to foist on him was one of his biggest political enemies in the army.
Did any of what von Steuben did translate down to forces in the South?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah. So the way that that's going to happen is some of the forces that are at Valley Forge are actually going to migrate south under Nathaniel Greene for that southern campaign. But also, as the Blue Book is printed by Steiner and Sist in Philadelphia, they start disseminating that out through. So there are, in some instances, officers in those regiments that may not have been at Valley Forge are under orders to read the book and implement it. So maybe it's a little tougher for them if they don't have somebody to show them the ropes, but there's a system that's in place to make sure the entire army has it. My opinion is that by the middle of 1780, almost all of the army's officers have access to that book.
People had mentioned before that they have relatives who were in the revolution. I focused on Debbie because we're talking about Valley Forge, but that's not to shit on your relatives. So tell me about your ancestors. We'll start with you, Michael. 6 questions left.
Yeah.
What was his name? Who did he fight with?
Jared Tolles. He was in the Connecticut militia.
Okay.
He fought at the siege of Boston. He was there at New York. He was at the Battle of Kips Bay and the Battle of White Plains.
Oh.
With the Connecticut
fun times
militia.
for them.
Yeah, and then he would go to the Danbury raid, and then he'd be wounded there, and that's where he gets his pension application is the wound from that.
Cool.
So he's in the militia that comes and goes.
Okay.
In that early period.
Who else raised their hand on that side? You, Coleman. Yeah.
I had a relative named Roger Brooks who fought. He was from Virginia, but I don't have any other information beyond that. And I did have a relative who fought at Cowpens.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
Most of my family's from the upstate of South Carolina.
All right.
Benjamin Martin.
Not exactly.
You love to bring him up.
I do. Did you have one, Elaine?
Yes, but I didn't look at Ancestry today. I looked at my background reading, so I couldn't tell you about the story.
Did you don't know any like where he was from or anything about him?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Apologies.
Over on this side, Steve Byers.
My 8 times great grandfather was Major John Cessna of the Pennsylvania militia.
Invented the airplane.
Yeah. But his history, actually, he was in the Forbes expedition in the French and Indian War.
All right.
He was a young officer there. So he's actually in his late 40s, pushing 50. In 76 or 75, he's voted to the Pennsylvania State Assembly. He will be re-elected in 76. He signs the Pennsylvania State Constitution.
So you got a radical.
So but he will then he will join Washington after Princeton in 77, and then as Elizabeth's over and he goes back and he becomes a wagon master and a sheriff in Bedford County, and will be running wagons from Bedford to Shippensburg to Carlisle to Reading, to help supply Washington's army.
Wow.
So he's not in Valley Forge, but he plays a role.
He's doing a lot.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he will, and he'll be a sheriff until into the 1790s.
Okay.
You know a lot about him.
Yeah.
There's a book about him.
Oh yeah. My relative has a book written about him. Was there somebody else on this side?
I did, but
You did. Who?
but it's not fancy. Like
Well, I know. I'm sure it makes
I know, right?
now, I'm like, oh yeah, I've got somebody.
No. What do you?
No.
Tell us about yours.
No, so mine, I think he was 7th great grandfather. His name is Nehemiah Moxley from Maryland. He was Sons of Liberty, a member of the Sons of Liberty,
Yeah, sure.
and he was responsible for part of the Tea Party in Annapolis.
Nice.
So that's
One of the overlooked tea parties.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So that's how I
yeah.
got my little.
Philly's got one
membership.
too.
What I think maybe people, well, you guys might not know this, people at home, you should definitely come and visit the Gettysburg area. And when you're out here, stop here at the Mansion House 1757, because in the back, the original part of the building, legend has it, right, George? We don't know for sure, but legend has it. George isn't there? Yeah. Okay. Legend has it that patriots conspired against the crown in this very building here. And there's a lot of history, colonial all the way through to now. Probably the biggest event in history is this series of 4 tavern talks that we've done here in the last few months. Now, Ken, what is the legacy of Valley Forge
I thought
to
you were
wrap
asking
things
what the
up?
legacy of Tavern Talks was.
Well, we'll get into that in the special features.
You had me and Hessler, so it was good.
I know. Star-studded cast.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. Why do we remember it? Why do we go? And I have a reason. I have an answer to that I think resonates. But I kind of want to hear from some of the audience first, because that would be helpful. Yeah.
So the question is specifically, what was the legacy for the Continental Army? But if you want to expand it to just American history,
I like
by all means.
I mean, well, look, the legacy for the Continental Army, I think, is pretty simple. It's where they are forged into that professional force. Okay, it's where that army, that new army of 1777, grows up in a lot of ways and learns a lot of hard lessons. That's done in the context of suffering. I mean, I think that's the really simple way to put it on the drum head. But I think the more complicated and the more interesting question is, what is the legacy of its story? What is the legacy of the place? Why do we remember it? Why is it maintained?
And for me, I think it's one of those cases as Americans, we like to see our history and the formation of our national identity and our national self as being forged by difficulty and hardship.
Yeah.
Valley Forge becomes that symbol of difficulty and hardship in a difficult time and overcoming that to achieve greater victory. And for Americans, we like to view ourselves in that way.
Yeah.
That though victory will come, it will not be easy. And there will be Valley Forges. So we look at the soldiers who served there, we look at Washington and his example, and we draw upon that, especially in times of difficulty, to see us through.
Yeah. There is a resurrection narrative or a Phoenix from the Ashes narrative that really fits that, Mike. Yeah.
Debbie?
I know for those of us like me personally who can point to a person who was there, I've only been able to go there once so far, but I will definitely be visiting again now that I know a little bit more. But it's because it's been preserved, I can literally walk in my ancestors' footsteps.
Yeah.
And that's huge. I can stand there and imagine what it must have been like for him and say, thank you. Because of what you did here, I get to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And
the
without
4th New
those
York.
Spaces.
Right, he was 4th New York.
And Enoch Poor's Brigade.
Poor's Brigade. So you go to,
So, without those spaces, that's a huge thing for many Americans to be able to walk the ground and say, this is where my ancestors stood.
That is a great point.
It's an excellent point.
Yeah, you have that. Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking, Mike talked about it, being forged, it created the new army. The first thing that popped into my mind, I hate to say it, there was a new birth of freedom here in Gettysburg, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what's the new birth of the American Army, the new birth of America. Not even new birth. It was the birth of America. It seems like trace it back to Valley Forge. It could have all ended during that winter. We were down to, a small amount.
Yeah.
Von Steuben came in, we kind of moved on from there. So to me, it's that birth of America really was Valley Forge. There's Independence Hall, but Valley Forge is where it really happened.
The Independence Hall is the birth of the idea, right? But we had to
a
forge
physical
it.
location.
Yeah, I think the birth of America for who is an interesting question to ask at the same time, right? And what is and some of this is going to be rhetorical, okay? But what is the revolution really even about? Like, really, if you think about that, why is this war even being fought? I can tell you what I think for most people looking at the revolution who are not extremists in the 18th century. They feel that their rights as Englishmen had been abridged. And in the 18th century society where monarchy rules the day in Europe, the British monarchy is really different. It's not absolute. It's not despotic. There is a clear separation of power between Parliament and between the Crown. And that is an issue that Britain figures out during its own very long, very bloody civil war in the 17th century. And the days of absolute monarchy died with Charles I.
Yeah.
When the Hanoverian kings take over in the 18th century under George I, you start to see the emergence under Walpole of what really becomes an actual prime minister. And the separation of that power and the collaborative efforts between the monarch and the prime minister is the intermediary with Parliament, and what Blackstone will later call in his Laws of England, the separation of the dignified and the efficient in British government. Americans look back to that example in the 17th century, particularly landed white gentry, and they say, okay, we fought this war against France and her allies. We have come of age. We have been colonies now for over 100 years. We have spilled our blood arm in arm with the mother country to expel the Spanish, to expel the French, and I'm just going to be very honest with you, to push the natives west so that we have economic opportunity for ourselves. And they start to think all of these problems about taxation, all of these problems could be solved if North American Britain had its own parliament, and that there was a separation of power between our parliament and the king. And parliament here would represent the interests of the landed gentry just the way it does over in the mother country. It's time for us to have that. That's why most of these people, I think, who are not extremists, who are not from lower classes, and the lower classes, it's not to put them down, but they have their own political ideals. Think about the Germans, think about the Scotch-Irish. We scratched this stuff early. It's really complicated when you think about this. That's what they want with this rebellion. And it got out of hand fast. And when it got out of hand fast, people had to start making decisions about what side they were going to go on. So for somebody like a William Allen, who I referenced earlier, he might have started for one reason and said, I want out of this. This is not for me. And then, oh my God, this American Revolution is the biggest mistake in the history. So the way that we view the revolution is sort of like when we started, oh, Washington is the God, right? Well, the revolution is the God. What we've done to a political revolution and in the 18th century has given it apotheosis syndrome over the past 250 years. And I'm not going to judge that and say that's a bad thing, but I think we need to think about that. Because here's why I think Valley Forge is important. Here's why I think the revolution is important. Here's why I think these discussions are important. Here's why I think the study of history is important. If we look at the Civil War, whatever we want. Because I do a lot of work with that too. And I'm going to give you a quote by a guy named Fred Anderson. I usually do this at the end of my tours. Anderson says, an old world began to pass away. Today its traces linger mainly in the names that forgotten peoples gave to places we now claim as our own. That we remember so little of this earlier world and understand so little of its people and their ways bears witness to the evanescence of all historical worlds, including the one we ourselves inhabit. In that sense, to grasp the story of the Great Transformation is above all to understand it as a cautionary tale. One that illustrates the unpredictability and irony that always attend the pursuit of power, reminding us that even the most complete victories can sow the seeds of reversal and defeat for victors too dazzled by their own success to remember that they are, in fact, only human. We cannot be too dazzled by our own success. And if you want to think about the American Revolution in a military sense, it ends in 1783, and spoiler alert, we win. Okay, right?
What?
Yeah, right. So, but the American Revolution as a very radical experiment in political and philosophical thought that has the capability to lead not just to the emancipation of human beings, but lived out to its full extension to emancipate human beings from the condition known as suffering. That American Revolution, I don't think most of the founders ever envisioned. But that's what it really is. And that American Revolution never ends. And it doesn't necessarily get fought with yelling and partisan politics. It doesn't get fought with military conflict. Much of the way that that war is fought depends upon how citizens act in their own lives, how they act in the context of their communities, how they act in their interactions with other people. So when you look at the American Revolution that way, its ultimate success or failure in every generation depends on us. And this is our time.
These were supposed to be, and this is a compliment.
Yeah.
These were supposed to be anti-lecture lectures where the audience does most of the talking.
Right.
But I think we are all enthralled with you. You're like a preacher on the American Revolution. And I'm seriously, you did such a great job tonight. And I'm sure the viewing audience at home, if they like the format of these Tavern Talks, will forgive us this time. But I think it's also very important that, we were talking about Valley Forge, but you gave us a really good understanding of the Revolutionary War, at least those couple of years that we were talking about. And most of us don't have that. It's not taught in our schools anymore. And most of us...
Oh, wait, except
Steve
with an
teaches
exception.
it.
Steve teaches it.
Steve, okay, one school in the entire country teaches it. I don't know how many times people come to Gettysburg and they think this is that George Washington shit. You know what I mean? So somebody's doing something wrong somewhere in this country. It's not you, Steve. But it's not being taught well enough, at least, and on the whole. And I hope that people watching kind of got a sense of what this country went through to get born. And to me, I used the word before, miracle. It does seem like a miracle that we're even standing here as citizens of the United States of America and not something else. And it's not just the Revolutionary War and that period in general that makes me think that you got the War of 1812 where we're invaded. You have the Civil War where we're fighting each other. There's a lot of things that, to me, make it seem like a miracle that we still exist. And I don't know what that means. I don't know why that is, but it is what it is. And so, I don't know. I just think it's very cool. And I thought this was really great. And for those of you who came here wanting to talk more, I'm sorry if you didn't, but nobody wanted to hear you. We wanted to hear Ken. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this, and thank all of you guys for coming in here. We have a lot of the same faces that came in, and I really appreciate the support from all you guys. And I hope you enjoyed these, and I hope you enjoyed yourselves tonight, and I hope you all enjoyed yourselves at home. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Thanks.